Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first Rodale Institute webinar coming to you live from Rodale Institute's library here in Kutztown, Pennsylvania. I'm your host, Rick Carr, and Compost Production Specialist here at Rodale Institute. And today's topic is compost science, separating the feel-good from the real good. Just a few housekeeping items before we begin. Webinars is a relatively new format for us at Rodale Institute. So if you experience technical difficulties, please call our IT department. I have a number there that you can see the technical difficulties, and there's a phone number there. We have somebody standing by to assist you. Now, during typical presentations with live audiences, there's usually time for a question and answer. That could be challenging with webinars, of course, but I organized the presentation to allow for breaks and a short Q&A in between some of these major topics here, particularly after the physical characteristics, chemical and biological characteristics. The subject, compost sciences, can be technical. So it's going to be heavy with some data. Want to illustrate some of these things that we might take for granted when we're discussing compost, but to show that some of these fundamentals are actually driven from research-related projects. So there's going to be a lot of information you're going to see, and some of the research publications, the sources for the information will be available on the individual pages. All right, lastly, this presentation is being recorded and will be available to all participants. So with that, let's get underway. And again, welcome to Rhoda Institute. We are a 333-acre organic agricultural research farm. It's here in Kutztown, Pennsylvania, as I mentioned. Very diverse operation. This is just a live shot, aerial shot of it. You can kind of see on one side there's a dairy operation on the, I guess that's the right-hand side, and we have another dairy operation on the left-hand side that's out of view, and then we're in between. Now, one thing that's very different between Rodale Institute and these dairy operations is the projects or activities that take place. We're very diverse, so we have orchards, we have animal operation, we have honeybees, diversity of crops, vegetables, grains, pastures, and of course the probably the most important is our flagship experiment, our farming systems trial. This was started in 1981, been going on for 35 years now. This is one of our web pages here that you could download the PDF of our brochure, and it has a lot of our data in there. But our farming system trial is basically a long-term side-by-side comparison of organic agriculture and conventional agriculture. And after 35 years, what we have demonstrated through all the data that we collect is that organic agriculture can meet the yield and surpass the economics of conventional agriculture. And particularly in years where there are drought situations or years of stress, plant stress, too much water, too little water, drought, heat, the organic agriculture more times than not will outcompete in yields and economics that of conventional agriculture. So I encourage you to go on our website and check out the 35-year report is now available. But search around on our website. We do have other things that we offer at Rodale, other webinars and other events. So please search around as you have time. Okay, let's get to one of the hottest topics, though, at Rodale Institute is the composting. We have a large-scale composting operation, so arguably the hottest activity we have going on here. But we have two operations, or 2 yards that you're seeing. one of the research yards, and then up on top of the hill in the background there's our second one for larger production. But we'll accept feedstocks from anything that we generate on farm. We bring in leaves from 6 different municipalities. We bring in grass. And what we're trying to do is formulate these and gather as much information we can, and with the idea of that this information is going to help farmers. It's going to increase soil fertility, aid in soil health. Now, you get the question often, why compost? And I like to go to some just general waste management perspectives. So the typical waste pyramid that you see here is, you could look at it, you see prevention at the top, and then all the way at the bottom is disposal. And you could pretty much view this as the energy that we would put towards each of these activities. So prevention, signage, or avoiding waste in some way. We tend in the United States not to put that much attention towards that, and we spend a lot more money in disposal and landfills. So why compost? We're looking at that at the bottom of the pyramid, at disposal, and with that disposal is a lot of organic material. Now, if we really wanted to make a difference in our waste pyramid or our waste management in the U.S. and globally, we would take that pyramid and put it upside down. And that's what you're seeing here. This is from a recent article in Biocycle, where they're saying, all right, source reduction. We need to put the most amount of energy into that and the least amount of energy into landfill and incineration. And in between, composting is going to be there as well. Some solid waste by the numbers. I'd like to show just where we stand. The United States, it shows that we are generating a lot of material, and it's increasing each year. So this is waste generation, the blue line. Waste generation over from 1960 to 2013, and there's no sign of it decreasing. What's more surprising is the amount of material that, on average, each individual person is generating. This is saying that, and these numbers are available through the EPA website. It's their every few years, it's the facts and figures they have. So this was published in 2005 for dates up to 2013. But it's saying, on average, Americans generate 4.4 pounds per day, which is an outstanding amount of material that we generate. What this material looks like now is, well, go to the recycling now. Fortunately, we are doing a lot better at recycling. Our recycling rates are increasing. We have there 34%. It's going up, and a lot of this is a function of technological advancements. So back in '85 and the '80s, we're figuring out different ways of using this material and new ways of recycling it, turning waste materials into resources. But what this material looks like after recycling and after composting, basically this is a pie chart of what is in our landfills. So all the things that has been diverted for recycling, stuff that may have gone to composting facilities, our landfills basically look like this. And what's amazing is that our landfills are, in general, on average, filled with 21% food waste. All right, so you take food and wood and the yard trimmings, these things combined, were 30% of our landfill is easily composted. So when it goes to a landfill, it's basically a waste material. You take that, you divert that to other things like recycling or organics recycling, composting. You're now creating resources from waste material. All right, the physical characteristics, this section here that I have, I just loosely chose physical characteristics, but composting in general, what I'm going to discuss here is water, oxygen, maybe the heat generation. We're talking about how compost piles heat up, why they heat up, microorganisms, kind of changes in compost piles in general. But composting, if I can give it the shortest definition, it's managed aerobic decomposition. You can take a banana peel, throw it in the yard, it'll break down, it'll decompose on its own. You put it in a compost pile, we're now managing it, and we're doing it aerobically, and ideally the decomposition process is accelerated. What the typical time temperature graph of the stages of composting, you have mesophilic, where you're just starting out, it's ambient temperature, and then immediately these materials begin breaking down, microbial activities are taking place at a tremendous rate, and all that activity is generating heat, and that's where we're getting that from. So you see that spike in the thermophilic, you have your greatest amount of bacterial decomposition taking place there. And then when resources become less available, you begin the cooling and curing process. What is really happening though is that blimp that you see in the graph, if you had turned the compost, you might get another one of those. It might not be as hot, but you'll get another one. And basically you're exposing new surfaces for decomposition. So here's some actual data that from compost piles at Rodale Institute, and on the left it's showing how we're collecting the temperatures. All right, so you can collect right in the middle, or you collect on the surface is what I'm showing here, and then at different areas. So when we certify our compost, I record 6 different locations, and I take an average of that to kind of give it a representative compost pile temperature. And so just to show you that the surface temperature versus the core temperature, so the dotted line being the core temps and the surface temps, they can follow roughly the same line, but you're going to see changes. So taking average of it, you're getting a better representation. All right, you get a question often about composting over the winter. Particularly, I get this for backyard gardeners or backyard composters that say, what happens during the winter? Is it still breaking down? It is. It's breaking down. It's always going to be breaking down at some rate. It might freeze solid, but here's a figure here, the top graph, it's showing that over winter. So that long line that's in the middle, that's what's happening from about the middle of December to March, the middle of March, or April, that looks like. And so the temperature does drop, but as soon as you start turning it again, the white dots or the white diamonds are dates that points that we're turning at those times. As soon as you turn it, boom, the temperature takes off again, and now it's decomposition is accelerating. And now if I just show just the 2014 portion after the winter, you can see, blow that up a little bit more, you can see that the temperature is going up and down, and some of that's a function of turning. When we're talking about compost, one thing that comes up, especially in large-scale facilities, is odor management and measuring oxygen. It's an important element in composting. It's what's driving aerobic decomposition. Now, how do you measure oxygen in the compost pile? We do have digital meters for that, dissolved oxygen meters that this gentleman's here demonstrating. And what some of the flaws in that is the meter is not inside or where it's recording. It's not inside the pile. You can't have the digital part inside. You have a probe that's in there and that's sending it out. So there's a disconnect. And so what we find that is that there's Dalton and Henry's law combined would say, first Dalton says that dissolved, or as temperature rises, just in general, as temperature rises, the amount of oxygen that can dissolve in the air will decrease. Now, Henry's law, take that one step further, says that As temperature goes up, the amount of oxygen that can dissolve into water goes down even further. And why is this important? Because the actual microbial activities are not taking place just on surfaces. They're taking place on wet surfaces, the biofilms around a given material. So a dry material doesn't have much activity, but it's when it becomes saturated or wet, it's breaking down. But so that requires that oxygen. Can oxygen dissolve into that biofilm to promote aerobic activities? If not, you become anaerobic and you get your odors. So these two gentlemen and others have come up with this some nice charts where you can do conversions. In this article, there's other figures there that can help you convert and calibrate your O2 detectors. But just given this, what I had mentioned about how changes in oxygen dissolve oxygen in water, and those biofilms can be influenced by temperature. You can see on the far right that list of numbers, right? So it's days since turning as it goes from the top to bottom, 0 days and then 9 days away from it, and temperatures changing as a result of turning. So as temperature increases down at the bottom, you have more oxygen that the detector's measuring because you turned, but because the temperature is increasing, you're actually having less oxygen dissolved into that biofilm where the activity is taking place. So one would say that, okay, it's getting close to turn because my saturated oxygen concentration is going down. But in reality, an experienced composter would probably just use their nose to figure this out. Is it starting to smell? So something to peace of mind, but nothing to be too concerned with. All right, with that, there is a chat window down at the bottom that I'm opening for questions. If there are, I'll give it a minute. If there are, and there's also a Q&A section. People are welcome to ask questions if they wish. I'll wait just a few seconds while I move on to the next topic. If I don't see anything, I will just continue on then. And I'll send a chat out just to see if everybody will message out, see if it works. And now you should be, chat window might be popping up. And that chat you would find under more options, probably at the bottom of your page. And it's, you click chat. All right, there is somebody coming in with a question. Did I get this right? If it smells, turn it. If it smells foul, yes, I would turn it. If it starts smelling foul, you're going anaerobic. Smell could be, compost will have a smell at all times. You want it to smell earthy. So if it smells, I would turn it. Is there an ideal range for sizes of composters? If we're talking at the smallest size, then you're going to want to say a cubic yard. So a 3 by 3 by 3 for your backyard system. Welded wire bins work really well for that. There's earth machines that are available for purchasing. The Darth Vader looking helmets, composters. They're under those dimensions. While they still work, things can break down, but you're going to lose a lot of heat because of the size. You're not generating much internal heat. There's too much change from heat out, the difference in temperature outside versus inside the pile. Okay, I am going to move on. Thank you for your questions. And chemical characteristics now. Okay, there's a lot of information here that I can only just skim. What I'm showing you now is just from a recent report that I put out on our composting program here, and it's an average. What you're seeing here is an average of a nutrient analysis that we get done for all of our finished compost piles. We get it done at Penn State laboratories, and so they'll give us a report that looks what you see here. And what I've done is taken an average of, this is showing 14 different compost piles, and I take an average of them. So the pH, on average, compost is going to have above 7, just on average, and here it's showing closer to 8. The total nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium is going to be low compared to synthetic fertilizers. You're seeing 1% nitrogen, total nitrogen, phosphorus under 0.5%. Same thing with or potassium, a little more. It's at 2.3, and you can see the plus or minus values that are there. Now, different from I think another one that's nice to point out is the carbon to nitrogen ratio. I don't have that outlined, but you can see it there. It's 13:1, which what is different though from synthetic fertilizers is they'll just have that NPK value, but we know that plants require up to 17 nutrients for growth and reproduction. Compost can supply a number of them. Whether or not it can supply all of them, we don't know. It takes a lot of testing, but so we're seeing calcium, magnesium, sulfur, sodium, aluminum, and all the other ones. We have that at different values here. And you can see they could vary a lot or a little in cases in some of these cases. Getting back to the pH one, I get a question a lot is what if you're adding a lot of acidic materials, and what happens? So acidic being under 7, pH of 7. So typically during the composting process and through microbial activities, you're going to be breaking down those materials, and pH is going to be increasing just as a result of organic matter. So this is what's showing, these are 4 different replicate compost piles that's showing that pH changing over time. So basically this is just supporting more of what the last one I said, where pH is going to be between 7.5, between 7 and 8. This is showing a little more precisely 7.5 to 8. Okay, we're getting in. I might jump around a little bit just to make some points about this. But so when we put compost in water, I'm talking about compost tea. So I'm going to talk about this a lot more at the end. But I want to show when you do something like that. So you see the starting materials, and I have here highlighted just calcium, just as an example, just to focus it on that. So I have here, you have the compost, and these are 2 different types of compost. There's municipal solid waste compost, and then ruminant being some kind of manure. And so we're showing calcium at different levels. Now, if we put that in water, what is actually extractable is much less than what's there. So we're not creating any nutrients by putting it in water. And so it's going to be less of a soil amendment in regards to a nutrient amendment when we use compost teas. Still effective, but it's going to be much less than the solid material. Now, this doesn't take into account the other benefit of compost teas, which again I'll bring up later, but it's the microbes. What happens to the microbes when we put that into water? And with that, I think I'm going to open it up for just another few questions if they're available. And I'll open the question here. Okay, so there was more clarity on how about a size of an aerated larger system for a small organic farm, the size of a composter. There's no standard size when it comes to your composting system. I think what you want to really look at is your materials, how much is generated, and base it off of that. It's not like you would create a system and then bring it in, or perhaps you would if you're a business. You would say, all right, I can handle this amount of feedstocks on a daily basis, monthly basis. An aerated larger system, again, you certainly don't want to be under a cubic foot, but perhaps 5 cubic yards would be nice. But your area, I've seen small cubic yard aerated systems, and I've seen as large as they come as well. So it will vary in between. There's no one right way to compost, aerated or turned or non-aerated. All right, another question was best place for soil testing in Berks, Lehigh County. This is in Pennsylvania, so it's a specific question here. I'd go through Penn State, the Agriculture Analytical Services Lab. You can go to AASL, Penn State AASL, and you'll find them there. And they do a great job for us. They have the, you can call them to get some information too if you're wondering about their tests and what they could do for you. That's where we get ours. We've done others. Cornell has one. There's other accredited laboratories that will do it, but I typically go to Penn State for mine. Any other questions? All right, real quick, is there any advantage to multiple 3 bins if we're building an aerated system? I think I'm going to handle that one after the presentation. I have my contact info available, and just to get clarity on that specific situation, I'll save that for after. How do you measure and control carbon, nitrogen, water, and oxygen? How often do you measure? The only thing I measure out of those, I do measure water. We don't have the probes for measuring oxygen right now. Carbon and nitrogen, I do that at the beginning. So I know my materials that I'm handling. They have so many leaves. That's my carbon material typically, but I will also have some straw. And then I'll balance that with the appropriate amount of farm waste, vegetable waste, or manures. Just through experience. One of those things is there are recommendations, 3 to 1, 5 to 1, in buckets of browns to greens when it goes to your backyard. But the thing to keep in mind is these materials, all of them are going to have some inherent carbon and nitrogen content. So you look at a tomato plant, it's going to be much more woody and brown, even when green and still living, than the actual tomato fruit. So it's something you're going to want to just practice, and at times you're going to make mistakes and learn from your mistakes. I guess one of the reasons I could sit here and give this presentation because I've made all the mistakes, and sometimes intentionally, just to figure out what's going to happen. Okay, I'm going to move on now to the next section, biological characteristics. I get this a lot, and this is a growing topic in the composting industry, particularly because technology. We can figure out, a lot of people want to know what's in there, and we're using molecular and genetic tools to answer some of these basic questions of what microbes are working, what microbes are helping me do disease suppression, or how is this helping my soil, how is it the microbial population is changing in the soil. So one thing to keep in mind that I stress is that not all compost is created equal. And so when we're asking questions about what microbes are in there, well, if you have a manure-based system versus a vegetable-based composting system, you're going to have a different microbial profile. So I say the biology of compost, finished compost, it can be case specific. Now this is this long list of bacteria that we're seeing here and organisms. This is just one example of the bacterial diversity in a finished compost and vermicompost, and that's their compost. I could measure that same thing on mine, and we would, might get a different response. So, I always wonder, if I showed this to somebody and said, yeah, well, here's what's in your compost. Now, how does that help you? I like to kind of question that when I give presentations. So you can have that tested yourself. Now, tests are certainly going to be much more simplified. It's not going to be that genetic analysis that you just saw. But you can get compost testing here, and you're going to see things like total bacteria. It's going to give you some counts here, and this is usually done using a microscope, and it's going to say things like you have a quantitative assessment here. So let's take the example of active bacteria or total bacteria, see 25 and 3,000, and it's going to give you a qualitative response saying excellent, good, excellent. And now as a practitioner, I always wonder what a practitioner would say if they saw this. Is that going to, if you saw numbers that said bad, would that change your operation? All right, so here's just another example too. I think, yes. So a different laboratory doing this, and you're getting the same kind of things, just it's showing you in a different way. So you get the active bacteria, active fungi, electrical conductivity, some of these important indicators of your or characteristics of a compost pile. But the issue I take with some of these analyses is some of these qualitative indicators. So the high, it says under active bacteria, it says 92 or 96.2. It says high, but okay, since percent AB is within range, see below, and it'll go into the interpretations. I'm not quite sure what that tells me. You know, given that I have a extensive background in microbiology and compost biology, doesn't say much to me as a practitioner. And so some of their interpretations that they'll have as well is you'll see further in one of the test reports. They give you a lot of interpretations, and the one thing that got me was this hyphal diameter. So they would measure the hyphal diameter, the fungi that are there, the fungal hyphae, and make claims like good balance of disease suppressive and normal soil fungi. I have a degree in plant pathology, and my background has been using compost to suppress plant diseases. And in all my experience and that of my colleagues, when I was doing the research, there's been nothing to substantiate that. There's no evidence to substantiate that claim. And so I throw up red flags when I see something like that, and it just shows me that they might be trying to just sell you something, and they're making interpretations off of kind of false information or a lack of information. They're filling that information void with misinformation. And so you just take caution with some of these reports. Now, what we do know about, I mentioned disease suppression. What we do know, this is kind of the understanding disease suppression and taking a step back. So some fundamentals of disease suppression. So we have a plant growing in the soil, okay? Now we know that there's soil microbes in there that have little interaction with the plant. We also do know that plants can attract or encourage the growth of certain microorganisms around the root systems and the seeds, right? So there's a close interaction. And now when we put into the picture a plant pathogen, how does that interaction play? You have the plant, you have the soil microbes that are interacting, and then you have the, shown here, Pythium ephemerdermatum zoospore, the little caricature that I have there. That's a soil-borne plant pathogen that causes damping off in seeds and seedlings. Very common, very ubiquitous throughout the globe. So you'd find it in a lot of soils. But how does that pathogen interact with the microbes and the plant? Yes, those questions. You ask also which microbes are operating here, which ones are associated with suppression. Okay, they also want to know how they work and why suppression would vary from one compost material to the next. All right, so people have spent decades trying to figure this out. I think some of the earlier reports that I've read was back in the 60s and maybe as early as 1940s when they were trying to answer some of these questions. Suppressive soils is what they were doing back then, and then until composting started really taking off and we're understanding it, they started saying, all right, what microbes are operating here? And largely to come up empty-handed. Nothing that we can say that's going to be operating at all compost. We do have some generalizations as far as we can go. And if something that you're very intrigued about, I'll tell you what, you can get a degree somebody will pay you to answer those questions. You go to any university and with some passion and enthusiasm, ask these questions, they'll pay you to do that. And that's basically getting a graduate degree. All right, so going back to the challenges using compost, in particularly with disease suppression and using it for controlling plant pathogens, that there's high variation in the final product. You would have less variation depending on the system you have and how controlled it is. So a vermicomposting system tends to be a little bit more controlled because it can be done indoors. Now, if you're composting outdoors, there's an inherent variability just due to time and temperature of the environment. Aerated composting systems, you can certainly control that more than a windrow composting system, but your feedstocks play into that, so that's going to influence your final product. Now, asking which microbes work, getting to that question, well, sometimes the microbes don't work, so why does the suppression vary from one compost to another and within the same compost? If I made repeated batches of compost, I might find at one time that it's not suppressive, and so we're trying to explain that. And then getting back to some of the fundamentals of disease suppression is how does suppression occur? So what are the mechanisms? Some that we have hypotheses and data to support these hypotheses is that there's anabiosis. So certain microorganisms that we know, we're very aware of, they produce toxins. They naturally produce toxins that are going to be antagonistic to the plant pathogen. So some of them are pseudomonads and bacillus. In some cases, we use these to our advantage and make biocontrol agents out of them. Other ones is nutrient competition. You have 10 to the 9th bacteria that are competing for the same resource in some ways as a plant pathogen, a single plant pathogen. And there's a few others that I won't get into now. All right, taking one example, going back to that zoospore, that caricature that I had up there with, here's another mechanism that I want to show is how does a pathogen like Pythium attack a host. Okay, on the top, the unprotected seed. We're showing this is a cucumber seed that we have here, well, a graphic of a cucumber seed. A seed, when it germinates and equally roots as they grow, they let off exudates. In this case, it's seed exudates. Right, a zoospore, swimming zoospores, these spores, the asexual reproductive structures, these zoospores, they swim, they have the ability to swim in water, unlike fungi. Okay? These are considered oomycetes. They have the ability to swim in water and locate their host. Very similar to a shark swimming chemotactically towards blood and finding its prey eventually. So it's going to make the zigzag pattern until eventually it finds its host and initiates infection. Now what happens though if we put that seed, that same seed, the same pathogen, but this time we have compost amended to the soil with a potting media? What's going to happen is there's bacteria that are attracted to those exudates because it's a food source. Right, linoleic acid being one of them. There's a lot of other food sources that come off, but these are food sources. Now, the resources for the bacteria, the community of bacteria in the compost. So they're attracted, and what they're actually doing is altering that seed exudate. So we're seeing that here with the purple gradient versus the blue gradient. They're altering it, and now by doing so, the seeds are protected by the microbes, and the pathogen can no longer detect and swim chemotactically towards the seed. It can't detect the exudates and therefore won't be able to locate its host. So that's one way we've identified that suppression is occurring. Okay, so what if though I can take that suppressive community around the seed, take that and from composts, and freeze dry that, all right? And take that powder and now apply that directly to a seed when I go to plant. All right, and that's what we're showing right here is that this is compost. It's freeze dried into a powder, and when you freeze dry something, it keeps some of the cells intact, the bacterial cells intact. What we found through preliminary data at Cornell was that you can freeze dry this compost and then add water back into it. So reconstitute it, add the water back to it, and make it active. And that liquid now is suppressive against the pathogen. That same situation with the Pythium and cucumber pathosystem. All right, so what I'm trying to do, though, in some of the recent research here at Rodale Institute is taking that powder and applying it to the seed coat using standard seed coating technologies that we have now. Conventional seed, you might find that it's different colors, right? That's a chemical and maybe just even a clay material that's spread onto the seed, and we're using that same technology to spread it, and I'm blowing that powder onto the seed here. So these are cucumber seeds with that material blown on, and basically that's some organic matter that you're seeing, that brown spotty material, but it's also live active bacteria from compost. And my goal here is to use this as a treatment for protecting seeds, a seed treatment for protecting seeds against soil-borne plant pathogens. So where I'm at now, is it a protective coating? You're going to have to stay tuned until the project's completed. We're still just in the testing this phase. We're finding some promising results, but nothing to go shouting about. So stay tuned with that. You can check back on our website throughout the year. All right, that was biology, compost biology, kind of in short. I'm opening it up to questions on that topic, so you could use the chat function or the Q&A function that's there. I have them both open. All right, so one of them was, how do you know when your pile is done? When it's not, a few things. So it's not heating up anymore. If you don't have a thermometer, you could use your hand and you can feel it. It's not heating up anymore. If it doesn't have a foul odor or it smells earthy. Another big one is, how does it look? Does it look like, can you resemble any of the starting material? That's a big one. So you still see apple core? Can you still see leaves? Or is it broken down to kind of a brown, crumbly material? That's how I would say it's done usually. It basically looks, smells. Any other questions? You can have them. And again, I'm also available afterwards. My contact information will be available afterwards. Is there any use to allowing the pile to alternate between aerobic and anaerobic microorganism degradation? That's a very good point, and I don't think I mentioned that much when I was talking about oxygen. Given that as temperature rises, the amount of oxygen that's available to even be in a compost pile decreases. So your entire pile is not going to be aerobic. You're going to find microclimates where it's going anaerobic. Now, if you're starting to smell an overwhelming amount of foul odors, that's leading you to you conclude that, all right, most of the pile is going anaerobic or to a greater degree than anaerobic, or going anaerobic more than aerobic. So it will alternate. So you turn it to open new sources and you create pores for air to be trapped in. That's what I would do there. So yes, it's going to alternate between aerobic and anaerobic. Your end state, though, is going to be, you want it to be aerobic. And the microorganisms, a lot of these microorganisms can do both. They're facultative anaerobes, where meaning that if under conditions, they could be anaerobic, and other conditions, they could be aerobic. Prime example, E. coli. That's a facultative anaerobe. It's living in your gut in an anaerobic environment, but it also exists in soils in an aerobic environment. Okay, my goal is to produce fungal-dominated compost. What are your favorite foods, techniques to achieve this? I would say if that's what you're trying to achieve, definitely the more woody materials. But in compost in general, you're going to have a greater dominance pretty much at all times, and I haven't included that figure here just for the sake of time. But at all times, you're gonna have a greater abundance of bacteria, and partially because fungi can't tolerate hot temperatures. So you wouldn't see fungal colonization in a compost pile You would really only see it in the beginning, but mostly at the end, where it's able to move in and colonize some of these more recalcitrant materials like wood versus some of the sugary materials like, let's say, an apple that will break down more rapidly than wood. So if that's what you're going for, definitely go heavy on the brown material. What advantage might a fungal-rich compost have? Fungal rich. For me, it's a diversity. Diversity reigns and uniformity pains. There are biocontrol agents such as trichoderma, it's a fungus that we use to our advantage. That exists in compost piles, most compost piles. It also exists in the soil naturally. So you want that in your compost. There's others that are similar. They have multiple mechanisms. The trichoderma itself, the fungus, has multiple mechanisms of disease suppression, but one of them is it produces a toxin. There's bacteria that do the same thing. Bacillus subtilis, they produce toxins. Bacillus thuringiensis, BT, that we've taken advantage for pest control, but that produces a toxin naturally. So you really want both of them. I can't say one way or another what advantage it might have, but I always shoot for a diversity. Any other questions? Okay. Lastly, last section is get this amendment rate. So that was, question just popped up. What rate of application to compost? Compost the topsoil is ideal. I'm going to talk about that right now. All right. So I mentioned it in the beginning. Not all compost is created equal. All right. So I'm showing you what I've done with my compost in my backyard a few years back, just to answer that question. How much compost can I amend? So this is compost amended to sand. Sand is inert, so any response that we're seeing is a function of the compost. All right, how much do I add to the soil? This is, you see sand, so it's 0, then 10% compost, 90% sand, and then all the way up to 100% compost. And I just threw some cucumber seeds. I did research with cucumber, so I had a bulk of cucumber, excess of cucumber seeds. So I'm always using cucumber, and you can get a lot of information out of cucumber seeds in 14 days. So what you see here is media, or the sand amended with compost, and you see it kind of a response. And I drew that red line to kind of show the tops of it. All right, so 10%, 25% is right with my compost. That's ideal. All right, you do see at the 100%, there's a few that just took off. All right, now if we took a top view, in research we like to do things in threes. Let's see if I have that here. Yeah, we do things in threes because there's variability. So I'm taking an average here. You see that 100% compost can suppress seed germination. So I had one pot there that had no seeds growing. There should be 10 seeds in each. And even in some of those other 100% pots, the germination is reduced compared to something like 25, 50%. So ideally, my backyard, if I'm using my compost, I'm going to add 25% by volume to my substrate. Now, what does that mean for a practitioner? Because you can't just, sometimes you can't calculate it like that. There's other ways of doing it. U.S. Composting Council would suggest that for new beds, creating or establishing a new garden bed or new soils that have low fertility, we would say, or U.S. Composting Council would suggest that you do 2 inches of compost applied to the surface of the soil and then mix that in. 2 inches. Now, if it's for existing beds, they recommend 1 inch of compost per year, just to supply the nutrients and the microorganisms. And here at Rodale, we would suggest the same thing. Now, 2 inches might not be practical for a farming operation. You just can't put 2 inches of compost over an entire acre. It's just a lot of compost. So you make the best of what you have. A manure spreader might get about 25% coverage on the surface, and then you're mixing that in or tilling it in or leave it in on top. All right, again, you're going to see that kind of a bell curve here. This is oats, I believe, in potting media now. So it's not sand. This is potting media. And I wanted to show this for our greenhouse operations. It's saying, all right, if you go above 50% compost or 75%, you start decreasing growth and plant performance. And so you can see that here, 50 and 75% amended to the media is ideal. I wouldn't go above 50. Some things that will influence this bell curve in a way is the age of the media, or age of the compost. A well-cured compost, you can get away with using more of it without harming plant production, versus something that's still a little hot. If you add that to the soil, you would be using it at a much lower rate. And the worst thing you can do is get into a situation where you over-apply and you harm plant production. It's better to under-apply, apply only minimal amount, and you're still getting the microorganisms and valuable organic matter into the soil. All right, compost teas and extracts. For probably the next 5 minutes, I'm going to talk about this. Now, what I've found in all my experience is that this is a hotly debated topic and tends to be emotional. And usually when people start thinking emotionally, they stop thinking rationally. So some of these are some kind of pure concepts, fundamentals of putting compost in water. Well, what are we doing? We're doing one thing. And no matter what system you're using, aerated or non-aerated, our basic thing is we're extracting some soluble nutrients, and we're providing an environment for microorganisms to grow. That's what we're doing. Either it's an aerated system where you're actively bubbling it, or a non-aerated system that you could do in your backyard here in some buckets. You see that, or you can get more elaborate that does things for you on your own. The system we have here, non-aerated, not anaerobic, but non-aerated. So that's what we're doing. We're extracting microorganisms and nutrients. At some point, they started calling it teas. Historically, compost teas have gone by several other names: liquid slurries, watery extracts, compost extracts. Me, I prefer to call them compost extracts because it's a little more accurate when we're discussing them. We're extracting material, just like you have vanilla extract. You're extracting a part of the whole. All right. So here's the systems that they all function and they all do a job at extracting. Some pros and cons that I like to share. An aerated system, some of the pros is reduced production time. So we're talking 24 hours to a few days. Anything less than 24 hours, you're really not maximizing your microbial growth. And even under reason for this is in microbiology, under the best case situation, in a microbiological lab, and we're growing bacteria, we give it 24 hours using the best situation. So incubators, the media, 24 hours for growth, right? So anything under than that, you're minimizing how much bacteria you can produce, right? Aerated systems, they will have a greater abundance of bacteria, and that's due in part to the availability of oxygen. Of course, you're adding more oxygen, more bacteria can thrive on that oxygen. Some of the cons, of course, greater costs. These systems can be quite elaborate, so there's always an electrical cost or some energy input. The equipment requirements, you saw some of those pictures. You could just have bubblers for a 5-gallon system. It'd just be like a fish tank bubbler, versus a non-aerated. You would just use the same 5-gallon bucket and a spoon and recirculate the material. So because of the increased oxygen, what happens is when you discontinue the oxygen, so you turn off that bubbler, that greater abundance of bacteria now are going to consume that available dissolved oxygen more rapidly, and you reduce your shelf life. So it can become anaerobic rapidly, and we're talking minutes to hours is possible. Now, a non-aerated system, of course, you're going to have lower costs. it's a difficult system to sell unless you're making it mechanical and having a timer set up for you, but lower cost because it's a bucket and a spoon. And that's how it was done, before we had a whole industry dedicated to this. Lower energy inputs, and because we're creating a stable liquid environment where there's natural oxygen dissolving in and out of the material, you're getting a longer shelf life, all right? But if you want to have a higher bacteria abundance, then you're going to need a longer production time. So I always tell people, if you're doing non-aerated system, you're going 7 to 10 days. You unfortunately will never reach those that population of bacteria in a non-aerated system compared to an aerated system. And there's a lot of disclaimers with that I don't have time to go into. So that's the general. All right, so what is my ratio? There's an infinite number of ways to make compost extracts. Your starting material, what you made your compost with, is going to be changing everything downstream from it. How you produced it, aerated composting versus windrow versus just a static pile. But anyway, now we're at the stage of we want to add it to water. How much do we add to water? So our bottom line there on the bottom axis is the ratio of compost to water. So 1 part, the first number there is 1 part compost, 5 parts water, right? And a lot of early research would just show like either a 1-to-1, 1-to-2, 1-to-5, and maybe a 1-to-10, and ignore a lot of the other stuff. So it's difficult to make kind of a lot of the claims from those early reports because we see something like this, and this is a non-aerated system. We're measuring pH. The CFUs is that dotted line with the X's. That's the bacterial abundance. And then we have dissolved oxygen, and then the electrical conductivity, the EC. So at a 1 to 5, your electrical conductivity, which is basically a measure of your salt content, and so higher salts are going to damage your plants more. It's going to be quite high in a 1 to 5 versus, go to the far end, a 1 to 60. All right, we want something much lower than, we're getting in maybe around a 1 to 30. It's about leveling off to certainly safe values here. And then the dissolved oxygen. All right, you have a greater amount of material that's trying to chew up all that dissolved oxygen in the liquid environment at a 1 to 5 compared to a 1 to 60. All right, so if you're at a 1 to 60 with the dissolved oxygen, you're achieving a little bit more aerobic conditions and promoting aerobic bacteria. And basically, in a compost extract is what you're really getting. There's not much fungus in a compost extract because most fungi can't survive in a liquid environment, or at least flourish. You're not going to get mycelia in the, kind of get mushrooms growing out of your liquid material. All right, and when we look at just the bacteria that we're getting out of it, it stays, more or less, the same rate from start to finish. All right, just a few minutes here. So if we have a material that's too high, too potent, what does that mean for starting seeds or growing cucumbers again? So we have water here, the first image, and then next to that, that same 1 to 5 non-aerated, that was vermicompost extract. So a 1 to 5 is going to significantly reduce radical growth and germination. Even a 1 to 30, there's no significant difference between water and a 1 to 30, but that browning at the tip of it is cause for concern. But when we were doing our research with this material and we were trying to figure out what material to start with, we went with the 1 to 60 for a couple reasons. One, if you're a producer and you can get away with putting less material into the water, you're saving yourself money. So 1 to 60 is what this is showing, or even a 1 to 30. If you have too hot, again, I think this might be my last slide, field applications using boom sprayers, you could use backpack sprayers. If the material is too hot, this is material that I knew was going to be too hot, decided to spray anyway, you can see it burned the leaves. You can see in the one field, the big image in the field of this is sorghum, that you can see that kind of orangey brown streak just from the sprayer. So you want to avoid that. All right, with that, that ends it. I think we're right on time. I'll stick around for a couple more minutes just to answer some last questions. But if you do have questions and you want to take them offline, I have up here a email address, the info@Rodale Institute. Put in the subject line, compost webinar. Please ask your questions, and I'll get back to you in a timely manner. But again, I will take questions now. I would like to thank everybody for participating. Again, this is our first webinar, and we'll have a few others. Check our website and our calendar of events to see what's going on. Any utility in adding other things into compost tea? And I'm guessing you're thinking molasses or kelp or something like that. These materials are typically added, I'm assuming that's what you meant, but these materials are typically meant to increase bacterial populations. So something like molasses is a basic sugar. Bacteria feed off basic sugars, and yes, you will get an increase of bacterial population. With that, that's all bacteria. So if there's a risk of E. coli being in your starting compost material, then you have that added risk of adding molasses. E. coli will feed off that same material. So I tend not to add these things. Sometimes they cost money, so it's an economic thing, so I don't add them for that reason. And another one is kind of a philosophical or fundamental reason that we have some basic data to support is there's nothing predictive in compost or compost teas. So you can't say, all right, if I have X number of bacteria, is that going to increase yield? No. And in fact, what happens is a portion of that bacteria, only a subset of it, will exist, will survive when you apply it either foliarly or in the soil. So you keep that in mind. And with that subset, only a subset of that is actually associated with some plant production or some plant value, suppression. So you keep that in mind. Only a subset, a smaller subset of the total is actually operating when we use this for plant production. I hope that answers your question. Any other questions? Well, okay. I'd like to thank everybody for participating, and please check back more for on our website for other information. We're here to help. Thank you.